and then D prime is by become obedient to the point of death. But anyway, it's a nice way to do it. Just as you look at this story, my first question is we usually think of Jesus' death and resurrection as how it affects us, because that's mainly what the New Testament talks about. But what is this hymn about? It's not so much about us. Whose perspective do we get here? It's odd because it's one of the few times we actually get, usually we think Jesus died for me, but there's no me here in this. So whose perspective is this hymn written from? Jesus, yes. In other words, the Oprah question, how did it make you feel? We usually don't ask that of Jesus too much, but that's what Paul does here. He's taken us into Jesus' interior life, which is just kind of neat. And the first, next question. What's the topic of each stanza? You could give a topic to each of these stanzas. What's the topic to the first stanza, and what's the topic to the second stanza? Or what's the first sentence, the first stanza about? What's the second stanza about?
Jesus as God, Jesus as man.
Yes, you could call it first stanza Jesus as God, and the second one is Jesus as man. Okay? And and is it just as God, Billy, in that first sentence? What's it describing in that first sentence? What is it describing in that first sentence? Not sentence, but stanza, like verses 6 and 7. That's what, that A, B, C, D there. What's it describing? What's first in the back? Yes.
Being in the likeness of God.
He was in the likeness of God. Yeah, that's where he is in A and B. He's clearly in the likeness of God, but then something happens, and Tom, you said it.
He surrendered himself. He yielded his personal rights.
Yes, he emptied himself. Jill, there are notes there in the back. Not to draw attention to you. And Jill, where we are, and I always do this for latecomers, so this is not odd. We are kind of at the bottom here of Philippians 2, and we're looking at, it goes over onto the bottom of that page and the top of the next page. It's that hymn of Jesus. It's the hymn of Jesus. Come on. So what Christian holiday, I'll give you another hint, is that first stanza about? What? What's that? It's Christmas, yes. So which, it's coming, so it laps a little bit into the next one too, but that first one is all about, someone just said it, the incarnation. Okay, and it is and there's very little on that in the New Testament on the humility of on that incarnation, but this is one of the main passages. So it's the going lower of God. It's God emptying himself. And Jill, by the way, what we just pointed out was this is the gospel from Jesus' point of view, this whole hymn here. So it's first about the incarnation, and then what's the second part about? So, someone said it already, but we'll say it again. What's the second stanza about versus that, the last half of verse, I've kind of indented it there for you to see it. So being born in the likeness of men, be found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. What's that? Yes, it's essentially, the first one goes from in the throne room of God to Bethlehem, and the second one, or I should say Nazareth, because that's where he's the Holy Spirit comes on Mary, and then the second one goes from Bethlehem to Easter. You follow me? Okay, and so it's what it is, if this is Jesus, let's make that a little bigger. If this is Jesus, so it's a double descent. It's from heaven down to to Nazareth, and then from Bethlehem down to the cross. And so and what is this drawing kind of gives it away, but what's the common theme then of both that first stanza and the second stanza? What's the common theme? You could say it 5 different ways. What's that? Descent, yes. Any other ways of saying it? It's descent. Humility. Yes. What's that?
Lowering himself.
It's lowering himself. It's what God does when he confronts evil. It's just remarkable. So it is, just thinking of some of these words, lowering, descent that you guys had, humility, and it's also, what other things is he losing? What happens when you go lower, when you lose humility? What are other dynamics of this?
Lose control.
Yes, so it's a loss of control. Isn't that amazing? I just think, I just can't get over the incarnation. I mean, none of us can. Because, I mean, I think that's why Christmas is so fresh every year. Because you didn't quite figure it out the year before. Because it's just so, it's just the lowering of God, and he's going down. So God is going down, and he's also going. This is a classic example of solving one problem and creating another. Did you ever do that in engineering? Yeah. And it is something, so it's a movement down, but it's also, and I'm just going to say this because I haven't figured out how to ask it as a question yet, but it's also a movement inside. It's incarnating. So he's entering, so he's going down and he's going inside. And the two movements are often associated with one another. So, just a quick commercial. If I'm in an argument with someone, if you stop and listen, you are losing power in that argument because they're getting the platform. You're giving them the mic, and you're also going into their world because you're listening to them. Do you follow me? So, so when you move from an argument, to listening, and it doesn't mean that arguments, Jesus is in arguments, Paul's in them. It's not that arguments are evil or wrong, it's how you do them. So when you actually stop and listen in that argument, you go through, and it feels like a little death to do that. Okay? So anyway, two movements in this passage. Julie, you had a comment or question?
I was going to ask about what do you mean by inside, but you just
Okay. All right. Good. So it's a movement down and in, and so it's just a quick commercial on. Well, this isn't so much a commercial on this. This is just more. I guess this would qualify more as a product warning. What does it feel like to do that?
Giving up your right to be right.
Yes, giving up rights to be right. That's the hardest one.
Feels like death.
Yes. Hence the word death for Jesus. Yeah. Lousy. Yes, good. It doesn't have to be that complicated. All right, we're just getting the broad things. And let's go back to that first page of your notes, and where I have the Philippians 2 passage there, written out in 2 paragraphs. What's the connection between the first paragraph and the second paragraph?
Second paragraph explains how to do the first paragraph.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to do it. Yeah, that's a great way to say it. The first paragraph explains, so first paragraph explains, sorry, I got that wrong. Eraser. So second paragraph explains the first paragraph. It gives you the map to what it looks like. Does that make sense? So the first paragraph is where Paul wants you to be, and the second paragraph is the path how to get there. Does that make sense? Anybody else want to add any different ways of saying that? Where Paul wants you to be, and then the second one, oops, I got it backwards again here. Anyway, any other people want to just say it in their own way? Yes, Millie?
It also provides a rationale. The second paragraph provides a rationale for the first one. Sometimes when you're teaching something like science or math, the students ask you, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to learn this? So it's almost Paul is saying, you should do this because.
Yeah, that's very good. That's a great way to explain it. Do this because, or another way of saying it is, little kid says, why? Why do I have to do that? And here's the why. And what is so neat about the why is that Paul is saying this descent of Jesus is when you're like building a building, you have the hidden I-beam structure, okay? And now Paul is, in the first 4 verses, he's showing you the outer skin of the building, as it were. And now he's taking you into the engineering diagrams, okay? And in the engineering diagrams, what do you see? This is an easy answer. You could say any one of 50 things. Yes? I'm sorry? The likeness of Christ. You see Jesus. And not only do you see Jesus, but you see that his life has a particular path to it. And so normal Christianity, what we should expect equals this downward descent. Okay? Now we're only looking at the death part. We're not looking at the resurrection. We will give equal time to resurrection, but anyway, that's what Paul's talking about. Any other quick thoughts on that? Oh, rats. I always do this. I always get ahead of myself. I'm saying rats because I said too much and I partly answered my question. But anyway, let me ask this anyway. What's the relationship between looking like Jesus and the story of Jesus? What's the relationship between or here, let me ask this question first. This is really simple. What is Paul calling us to do in this hymn? And I'm not, you can say it really any old way. What's Paul calling us to do in this hymn?
Be like Jesus.
Be like Jesus, or to imitate Jesus, yes. Now, what's the difference between imitating, what's the relationship between imitating Jesus and the story or the pattern of his life. And there's no one way to say this. It's just that I'm saying this because people, when we think of imitating Jesus, the first thing people think about is some kind of version of what would Jesus do. And I don't think that's a bad thing to say, but they tend to think of some version of be nice. Now, for a lot of people nowadays, that would be a real click up. If they would just start being nice, you know. I mean, we're not asking for anything fancy here. But Paul is saying more than that. What's the relationship between imitating Jesus and the story of Jesus' life? The pattern of his life. In other words, what's this downward slope? Yes?
Death to self.
Death to self, yep. That's what it is. Any other ways of putting it? Just say it loudly. We got some competition here. Servanthood. But I'm asking you to posit a relationship between the two. What's the relationship between imitating Jesus and, you know, because usually we think of imitating Jesus as be nice. I'm not saying that's bad, but Paul's saying something richer here than just be nice.
It's out of reverence.
What's that?
It's out of reverence to God. So it's not just the outer action, but it's because
Paul does say that in other places, although that's not quite so much what he's saying here. Yes, Bev?
Well, you can be anything on the outside, but we have to be internally changed.
That's a good way to put it.
Empty ourselves and being filled with God on the inside,
Yes.
so that we're not play acting.
Yes, so it's not play acting, it's not merely being nice, but I don't want to mock being nice, especially in Philadelphia when that's rarer. But it's something on the inside that's going on. And so imitating Jesus means imitating what about him? What? Humility. Okay, those are all right, but let me just say what I'm driving at, okay? So, what's that? Oh, it's just the outside. It's the story or the pattern of his life, so I imitate his whole journey. Do you understand that? In other words, his story becomes my story. Does that make sense? So, in other words, it's not just being nice. It is that. But behind that kindness and that gentleness and that humility is this engineering diagram. And you guys have seen me draw it, and I'll draw it again, except I've almost run out. Here, we'll just stick it over here. Is the pattern of his life is we have called it the J curve. And it's his life, and this is an angled J curve that looks like it's going to tip over. Life, death, and resurrection. So to imitate Christ is to expect, to be a believer is to expect that your life is going to look like this, that it's going to have that pattern to it. And it's going to have a lot of little J curves in it too, you know, and we'll talk about that later on. And so it's not merely imitating Jesus, but it's an internalization, and it's expecting, it's like so that this is going to be what's going to happen to me, you know, and because I'm a follower of Jesus, then I expect this pattern. Now we're mainly talking the death side, but I'm also expecting resurrection. So we're not a gloomy people. We are a death resurrection people. Okay? So that's Paul's expectation of his Christian life. Let me just tell you, did I leave this in your notes, the historical background, the imitation of Jesus? Is that just a little bit in your notes or a lot in your notes? Is it what? Is it like a sentence? Okay. Let me just actually do a commercial on WWJD, which might seem odd because you would think everybody would want to imitate Jesus. I mean, even oddly enough, non-Christians will often, I mean, Gandhi built a career out of the imitation of Christ. And he was not a believer at all. He was a Hindu. He would actually chide Christians for not taking Jesus seriously and loving their enemies. But the idea of imitation on Christ, particularly among scholarly circles and but even among evangelicals, and it's particularly strong in my own Reformed world, is there is a dislike of the imitation of Christ. Because there's a fear that people will turn it into a way of salvation. And what happened in the Reformation was the medieval church had taken the image of Christ and made it into what we called last week, we talked about asceticism, where you do suffering for its own sake. Now, the medieval church condemned the flagellites, but there was these people that would go from town to town beating themselves. I think Monty Python makes fun of them in his movie. But anyway, doesn't he? Am I right? The flagellites, but that kind of beating yourself up. A lot of the abuses of the late medieval church came out of a imitation of Christ. Or put it this way, they had the person of Jesus without the work of Jesus. Okay? So, in other words, they were wanting to live a crucified life without a crucified Savior as the foundation of that life. Okay? So, because of that, there's this fear, particularly it's very strong in the scholarly circles about a cheap imitation of Jesus, because they're afraid it will somehow undermine justification by faith. Now, is Paul nervous about that? No, Paul is not nervous about that at all. In fact, as we spent the last 7 weeks doing, Paul puts those two truths right together. He says, and in fact, in other words, to know that I'm justified by faith is the only way that I can really do this J-curve with joy. You follow me? Because I have received my righteousness in Christ, then what the J-curve is the other person taking you away your righteousness from you. And it helps you to take seriously the work of God for you. Does that make sense? I don't know if that point is too obscure. Let me just pause there. Does anybody think that's really odd what I've said? Or who has never heard what I just said before? Jim has just never heard this idea before, that the imitation of Jesus is almost a bad thing. Who has, or let me put it the other way, who has heard that? Who have heard people say that? Only a couple of you have had it. So it's a new idea that I'm sharing that to you. But it's why you don't hear a lot of language of imitation of Jesus. Be like Jesus. Paul says it all the time. In fact, Paul goes on and says, be like me, as I am like Christ. And it's the reason is that we got stuck, and we were so excited by justification by faith that we missed the other half of the gospel, union with Christ in his suffering. We got union with Christ where I am declared righteous by the Father, but we didn't get union with Christ where here's where I really sucked into the life of Jesus. Now let's compare these two passages here. Let me go back to the first page of your notes. And let me read Philippians 3, 10 and 11. And my question for you is, how is this similar? What similar patterns do you see in 3, 10 and 11 with verses 5, 6, 7, and 8 in Philippians 2? That I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. What are similar patterns you see between Philippians 3:10 and this Philippians 2 passage that we've read? How are the two similar? I mean, it's so obvious it's a little hard to say. Because they're almost identical, Jim. They're both J curves, right? And what's the and the J curve is death and resurrection. What else are they? They're both J curves, but what else is Paul doing with them? Well, let me put it this way. What does he want us to do with the J curve in both passages?
Get on board with it.
What's that? Get on board with it. To embrace it. Okay? So it's not just out there. Okay? It's something you embrace. I mean, one of the J curves that God took me through was I was demoted in an organization that I worked with. And I thought it was unjust, which gets most of us do, but I really did. But what does that? And the job I was given was development director. Okay, so now apply the J curve. What are your two possible responses? If you don't have the J curve, let us start out first by applying the J curve. How do you apply the J curve to that situation?
You would see that as God's handcrafted direction for you. You get excited and do a good job.
Yes. In other words, you actually, because who are you now doing it for? Jesus. You know? So, it doesn't mean that you're not honest with different people, but it frees your spirit up almost in some of the same ways that justification, but because I'm receiving this from the Father. Jesus says in John 10, no one takes my life from me. I give it. Isn't that great? And he really does. He eluded the Sadducees for a period of several months. And it's very clear the Gospels, John mentions it in particular. He would go out. There was a particular village he would hide in. That whole thing about the jar of water and the donkey when they had the Last Supper together was Jesus almost a code that he had arranged so he could slip into Jerusalem unnoticed. He was eluding capture, so that's why he tells Judas to go. What he has to do quickly. Jesus was the master of his own death. He embraced what the Father was giving to you. Now, in that demotion, I didn't choose that. I was not like Jesus, but I embraced what the Father has given me. Now, what's the other path to go on? Some of us might know what that's like.
Playing victim.
Victim. And what's so hard about the victim is you are a victim. Which, go ahead. Victim, what else? Mary, any other?
I'm like living this out right now.
Okay. I could probably do a show of hands as to how many people in different ways, or I bet you half our hands would go up. Victim. And then what are some of the things that happen in your heart? Victim. Rebellion.
Unfair.
What's that?
Unfair.
Yeah, unfair. Bitterness is the cancer. It really is the cancer on the other side.
And feeling justified in all that
Oh, yeah. I mean, because all those things are things that are truly, and bear with me, let's just say for the sake of the argument that I was unjustly put down. And here, God's given me these teaching gifts and these writing gifts, and what God wanted me to do, though, was He wanted me to enter the gospel so I could explain the gospel. He wanted me to get to know His Son. My instincts are to read books. That's a great way to get to know things. But He wanted me to actually journey into the books. Not to just know the gospel abstractly, but to journey into the gospel. And I tell you, the gospel becomes, the brilliance of the gospel gets so much brighter when you're inside the gospel as opposed to just receiving the gospel. Does that make sense? I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip that literary background. The similarities between Philippians 2 and 3, but there are a number of words that are in common between those two texts. And then this final question here at the end of point 1. So is Paul talking about just evangelism or the suffering that he encountered as a missionary of the gospel? And I worded that wrong. Forget the way I worded that. Here, let me forget that question. Let me read it. When Paul says that he wants to enter the koinonia, which is the word fellowship, this intimate fellowship of the sufferings of Christ, is Paul talking merely about the work of his work as an evangelist and a missionary? Because it certainly was true that applied for him. But as we see Paul doing this, what's the answer to that question? Is Paul talking just about evangelism? Tom?
I would say he's talking about every one of us.
He's talking about every one of us, and the Philippians 2 passage makes that very clear, because he's talking in that whole section about how we relate to one another. Does that make sense? And a lot of scholars, they just absolutely drop the ball on this because they don't know what Paul's talking about. It's just amazing how silent the commentaries go at this point. And some of them say, oh, he's talking about his missionary work, but it is as clear as glasses on my face that Philippians 2 is talking, that it has implications for evangelism, and certainly this applied to Paul in evangelism, and he will take this J curve and apply it to evangelism, but Paul here is talking about the whole entire Christian life, right? And that's what this next diagram is on the shape of the suffering. And what we would like is this. Instinctively, our desire is this. The shortcut, right? Jim?
I would say that Jesus, in the way he lived his life, put the U-turn in the J curve. And it's up to us to do our best to imitate.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
to mimic.
Yes, and I love those words, imitate, and I even like mimic, even though a lot of scholars I know would cringe at that. But mimic simply means to copy. And that idea is all through the New Testament and the Old Testament too. And we tend to imitate what we love. And it is not something we can do in our own strength. I mean, the only way we can do this is to have the very Spirit of Jesus in you. But I tell you, there's something immensely attractive about this. And it reshapes your whole experience then of suffering. So suffering is not strange, but it becomes a door to going into Christ. Julie, I didn't give you any advance warning on this, and I should have. But, and maybe it would be better, so you can turn me down. But would you mind sharing briefly about when you were going through that really hard time in your life back in '98? is that? Do you want to come up here?
How do you want me to?
It was just what you were sharing at prayer meeting the other day, and you just explained the story and then our phone conversations.
I've been through separation and divorce, and when I went into the separation time, I've been separated and I'm now divorced, but during the time that I was going through the most difficult point was when my husband had left. I wasn't sure we were going to stay together. I didn't know what God was doing. I would be on the phone a lot with Paul. I just had met him shortly before that, and I was actually teaching the person of Jesus at the same time. And there were times when I didn't know that I could even get out of bed. I wasn't even sure that I could go through the day without it was just incredible suffering. I can't even describe how. There was times when even suicide felt like it would be a relief because there was so much pain. And Paul shared with me the Philippians 3 passage, and that just, I clung to that, is that I wanted to know the fellowship of sharing in God's suffering so that I could then receive the resurrection from the dead. And I don't remember ever knowing Christ more deeply than I did during that time. And when he took me through that painful time, I wanted to, my first instinct was to get out of it and to try to relieve myself from it and find ways to get through the suffering. But what God wanted to do was to take me through that death so that then I could have the resurrection. And the resurrection part is now my life, working for See Jesus, training women, teaching them about suffering and about sharing in that fellowship. But I know I couldn't do what I'm doing now had I not gone through that death. And that death of, there was a lot of deaths, death of a marriage, death of dreams, death of expectations, just lots of things that I died to. Death of my demands, death of self. A lot of mini deaths along that way, but the resurrection, and I remember Paul just kept saying, after death is resurrection, and I had no idea what that would look like. I couldn't even imagine what resurrection would look like, because with a marriage dying, all you want is to save the marriage. You think that would be what resurrection looks like, and turns out that isn't what happened, but I stayed in the death part until God brought about the resurrection, and I don't think I would have known Jesus today like I do had I not gone through that.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Yeah, amen. I know a number of you here too have been through that, very similar situations. Let me give you one more example of death. What do we do? Let me give an example of what people do, and let me describe a scenario. Christian leaders, this is a true story, names have all been changed in a few details. Christian leaders A, B, and C were all in a organization, kind of an informal network together. They were well-known Christian leaders. And so A, B, and C. A and B were concerned about C's theology and some of his lack of wisdom. And they wanted him out of the organization. And I don't think that was inappropriate for them to want that. I think I would have been, I had concerns about C's theology too. So there's A and B wanted C out. Got it? C, then they, A and C was planning to leave quietly. And then 2 months before he was going to leave, C was going to leave quietly, A and B decided to publicly boot him out, which made C mad. And he went public with some misstatements that A and B had made about him. And these are all household names, by the way, in the evangelical world. But, and I thought, how would fellowship of sharing in his suffering have helped all of them? Well, let me begin with C, who was booted out of the organization. What they were doing is they were giving him a J-curve. They were humbling him. There's nothing wrong with C going to A and B about how they treated him, but to go public about it, to kind of publicly air your laundry, it was just corny. A and B, they also rejected a fellowship of sharing in his suffering, because instead of patiently waiting and just sort of living with the discomfort, and they were probably getting internal pressure in the organization to move C out, they could have lived with the suffering of the feeling of shame of this guy, or even someone in the organization threatening them, if you don't get C out of here, then I'm gonna believe me, people do talk that way. And so all of them, all these men who know the gospel well, didn't apply this fellowship of sharing in his suffering. Here's another story. And these were all in the Christian news in the last 6 months. These were all well-known, well, maybe I've gotten myself enough trouble with that one story. But it's just this idea of this joining Christ in his death erection is just foreign to the church. It's just the church isn't, from the leadership down, it's just not a known idea. And it's all over the New Testament. And that's why we're going to be sitting on it so much, and we're going to keep coming back to it and just sitting on this idea. But I did promise that we would end now, so I'm going to close in prayer at 10:40 here. Father, I just thank you for the wonder of Christ's love and the way he that through suffering you draw us into the life of your Son. And I pray, Lord Jesus, that you would do that with your church. Amen.